And thank you, Julie. Thanks. And it's great to hear about the changes in the laws, and it's great that there have been quite a few changes in the laws. And we want to make sure that you folks all hear from a couple experts on that. And with that, I'm just going to tell you who's going to present today. It's going to be Representative Cheryl Youakim, who's going to talk about the laws that have changed kind of in general. And Cheryl has experience at both the local level as a Hopkins City Council member and as the representative at the state from 46B. Cheryl's my representative, I have to say. And also then Sam Streukens from League of Women Voters Minnesota. He's a civic engagement coordinator, I think is the term. He is going to speak about the voting laws that have changed, and there's a lot of those as well. But before I turn it over to Cheryl, I'd just like to say a couple things about some upcoming events that are happening with the League. First will be a school board candidate forum, which is going to be a week from this evening, actually, September 21st at Edina City Hall. From 7 until 9. It will be recorded, so if you can't make it to the event, it will be on our website the next day, likely. And so there are 3 candidates running for 3 positions. They are Cheryl Berry and Jennifer Hoovey and Elliot Mann. So if you can tune in to find out what these folks are doing, are proposing, and so forth. Also, then in October, we're going to have our morning event will be on the local option sales tax that is being a part of the referendum to do some upgrades at Braemar. And then the November event, Thursday morning, will be a post-election and what went on in the elections. So that's the sort of the highlights of the next couple months. And there will be a student-led candidate forum as well, but we're not completely firm on the dates, so we'll wait and announce that.
It's definitely on October 23rd. So
okay, yeah. It is. Okay, good. Do the candidates know that yet, Susan?
No, they have not been invited by the students. So yeah.
Okay, thank you. And the students do all of the work around that. We can advise or help them, but they're the ones, they pull the student questions and so forth. It's really a welcomed candidate forum by candidates and board members. So with that, Cheryl, Representative Youakim, or Cheryl, I will turn it over to you, and thank you for being here, both Cheryl and Sam.
Thank you, Colleen. Welcome, everybody. I just had to go warm up my coffee so I could be awake for you. So I'm Representative Cheryl Youakim. I represent Hopkins, St. Louis Park, and Edina with redistricting. I am privileged to represent the part of Edina that's west of 100, north of 62. And I'd be remiss if I didn't give a huge shout out to my colleague in Edina that couldn't be here today, Representative Heather Edelson. She just announced yesterday that she's not running for re-election, and I still haven't gotten over that. I'm a little sad. She has been just a champion for your community and has really graciously introduced me to a lot of folks in Edina. And also, and she's on the Education Finance Committee that I chair, and she did some incredibly heavy lifting over the last few years to pass the READ Act, which is going to make a tremendous and historic investment in our kids around literacy. We really needed it, and I don't think anybody could have gotten it across the finish line like Representative Edelson did. So next time you see her, please ask her for the READ Act. It was just such a labor of love for her, and really do appreciate all the work. With that, as I said, I am the chair of the Education Finance Committee. I sit on the Education Policy Committee. I also sit on the full tax committee and the Ways and Means Committee. The Ways and Means Committee was busy this year. Usually we are a little sleepy until toward the end of session when the bigger budget bills come through, but there was a lot of things we got done individually. And I'm going to briefly touch on a few of those, go into some key highlights in some of the specific budget bills, maybe do a little bit deeper dive into education, because that's what I know the best, that and taxes. But then really want to leave some time for questions too. If you have any clarifying questions as we go along, just drop them in the chat or raise your hands. But otherwise, I'll leave kind of the meatier questions to the end if you don't mind. And I do tend to talk fast, but I'm talking fast too, because I want to make sure we save time for Sam Streukens to go over elections. And I'm really excited for his presentation. So I won't touch on that. Sorry, I won't steal any of his thunder. So when I talked about some of the bigger bills that went through on their own, I'm talking about, we did driver's license for all, which was supported by our business community and our law enforcement community, to finally allow, we had allowed non-citizens or visiting folks to get driver's license before 2003, when all of a sudden they decided to make it attached to a social security number. So that's something we have been trying to rectify for a very long time, because reason why law enforcement really appreciate it is because we want people to have car insurance when they're driving on our roads. So we passed that. We passed paid family and medical leave, which is going to set up a structure that our small businesses have been asking for, because they can't compete with the large companies that could provide these benefits. And everybody should have the time to take care of themselves or their families. Right now, I'm stuck in kind of that, I'm not quite an in-between anymore, because our kids are all in their 20s and launched pretty much. But my parents are going through some health issues. And if I didn't have flexibility with my job, it would be really hard to do what I need to do to take care of my mom. Then we also passed earned sick and safe leave. And I say earned because there's some skin in the game from the employee as well. And that is going to help our folks, especially our hourly workers, which I was a waitress, server in restaurants. That's how I paid for college, and also helped pay for my kids' college when they were little and we started their college funds. The last thing we want to do is having somebody come sick to an hourly job that has customer contact, especially when it comes to our food. And then I know I'm going to miss something if I do it this way, but we also did the PRO Act, which makes sure that everybody has the right to decide what kind of health care they need for their body. That was very huge. We did that right in the beginning. We did something the first week that our tax committee dug into right away that doesn't sound as sexy. We did some tax conformity to help folks. So when they did their taxes this year, it was a little bit easier. We also rolled into clean energy by 2040. And if we had Representative Kraft here, he could really do a deep dive, or Representative Patty Acom. Really, that's their area of expertise. So there was a lot of things we did before we put the budget bills out. And the reason why that could happen is because there'd been a lot of work done over them on these issues for about, some of them 4 years, some of them 10 years. I've been in the House for 9. Some of these issues, we've been working on them since then. And we just had the opportunity this year to finally get them across the finish line. These are some bills like the driver's license for all that have been heard in committees for the last 10 years. And paid family and medical leave as well, earned sick and safe leave. Just a lot of time and energy went into it. And finally, we had the opportunity to do what Minnesotans wanted us to do, which was get things done. So I'll go a little bit into the separate bills. So we had the ag bill really focusing on hunger and food deserts, money into hunger relief and Second Harvest. And Second Harvest, I do want to give it a shout out. One of the individual bills that was very close to my heart, and the only big individual bill that we let out of the Education Finance Committee, was universal meals, making sure our kids get fed. It's really hard to learn math and concentrate on learning how to read, so you can read to learn, if you don't know when you're going to get your next meal. So we passed universal meals off the floor, and now starting this school year, every child gets a free breakfast and 1 free lunch at school. It's one thing off their plate, so to speak, that they don't have to worry about. And it also helps really put some money back into families' pockets. We got to use the economies of scale, maximizing the federal dollars. For us to feed a child breakfast and lunch all school year, it's $250. That's $250. That could be a week in a growing family's grocery bill. And all the evidence points to what kids need to learn, and that's one of them. And one of the things we heard a lot on the House floor that Representative Sidney Jordan and Senator Heather Gustafson, who were champions of this, said, We don't means test for desks in schools. We don't means test if you need a book. Why are we means testing for food? Because that's just as essential for kids to learn as all the other things that we do in our schools. So that's something that's really close to my heart. And that's what it made me think of it when we talked about Second Harvest, because they were a huge ally in getting folks to the table from outside groups to really push and get that done. We also did put more money into the Rural Financing Authority, money into first-time farmers, and money into broadband, which is really important. One wouldn't think in farming, but most of their equipment is all digitized, where like down to how deep the machine is going to dig a hole to drop a seed, and using GPS to space that out and do their furrows. So farming has become really tech savvy, and they need that broadband to get it done. And then we also had Representative Pinto really doing an amazing job in children's and families. Used to be called our Early Childhood Committee, and we began to realize not only is it really important to get kids ready for school through investing in early childhood, but there are a lot of things outside of our schools that lead to the opportunity gap. And that is issues around stable housing, food security, access to healthcare. So now they're kind of pulling different areas out of each, a few of the state agencies that deal with just children's and families, and putting them all in one place, kind of a one-stop shop, so that it is much easier for us to really look at a whole family to get them stabilized, to let them be successful or help them be successful. But the Children's and Families Committee really focused in on one of the biggest areas of need that we have right now, which is childcare. If we didn't learn anything from the COVID pandemic, is that people need a place to put their kids when they go to work, and it directly affects our economy. And we have had a struggling childcare industry before COVID, and it was really hit hard during COVID. So extending some of those support programs that we did during COVID that had been federal dollars, making sure we give our childcare workers a livable wage. So helping the childcare providers do that with some more funding. And then also making sure that we are expanding those. They're called CCAP, and I'm of course going to forget what the acronym stands for right now, but it's the way we subsidize childcare. And then we also, of course, like I said, the clean energy by 2040 with clean energy solutions, and investing in public-private partnerships to finance for clean energy, supporting solar storage, putting money into that, and weatherization, and really talking about building out that electric vehicle network. They're focusing right now from the state funding to do electric vehicle charging corridors along Highway 94 and 35. And that is going to be a combination of state and federal money, and then using that as a pilot to kind of see where we're going to go from there. And then we had the conference committee who really tackled big pharma to try to get those prescription drugs down. And also something that I know Isaiah has been looking at for a long time, and that is looking at the predatory loans around payday lending. And also, I'm just reading my notes here so I don't forget anything. There's so much in a lot of these bills. Oh, this is one that's been around since I started 9 years ago, and that is the right to repair. It's another one that doesn't fit on a bumper sticker, that sticker that's very sexy, but it's the ability for people to repair their own products, electronic products, instead of always having to go to a dealer. You could ask Representative Fisher about that. He's been living and breathing that for about 9 years now. And we also looked at large insurance companies and how they report to the state, so we can make sure that things are going well. And it creates another thing that's very important that I know Congressman Ramstad and Senator Wellstone worked on in Congress, which is mental health parity in our healthcare system, in our insurance system. You also have the elections bill, which Sam's going to talk about, so I'll pass over that. We have our environment and natural resources that really invested in like lawns to lagoons and supporting our state wildlife. But one of the most important things our environmental bill did was looking really closely at the PFAS, the fluoro. Okay, now I'm not going to remember. I know it's fluorocarbons that go into our I'm trying to remember what I hate using acronyms without knowing what they are. And I used to know what PFAS was, but those are petrofluoral, I don't remember what the A stands for, but it's chemicals that are called forever chemicals. They leach into our groundwater, and it's really hard to pull them away from that water. It's not a simple process to get them pulled apart and pull it out of the water. There are processes like when you see a big oil spill to be able to do that, not with PFAS. That's why they're called forever chemicals. They stay there. So looking at how they're getting into our waterways and getting into our groundwater, and putting money into that, putting money into emerald ash borer, into our turtles, our minnows, our elks, our moose population, and then also our deer population with chronic wasting disease, which is something we've been looking at for a long time. Affordable and accessible healthcare is very important to folks, very important to all of us, actually. And I'm seeing that close up, walking my mom through her cancer treatment right now, and wishing that we had a little bit more coordinated care going on between all the different parts of her healthcare. But we are improving stability in the healthcare system, going down the path and looking at a way to expand our Minnesota Care to kids. We expanded Minnesota Care to kids under 6, so families can sign their children up for healthcare if they don't have their own policy. Improve mental health funding, that's with the parity. Create public insurance option. We're starting to look at a study to see what it would look like to create a public option for folks to buy into. Supporting our healthcare workers, especially our nurses, to make sure they have a safe environment that they're working in. And of course, as we talked about before, the productive freedom bill and banning conversion therapy for minors. We have that higher ed. We invested money, of course, into Minnesota State and the University of Minnesota. University of Minnesota is an amazing organization, and it's unique, though, because it's what's called a land grant college. So when we ask them to do things, we can only ask and say, pretty please, here's some money, get it done. Whereas we have a little bit more control at the legislature over the Minnesota State system. So when we give them money, we're able to say, you have to have a tuition cap. Not so much with U of M, but we always were working wonderful partners with them, because we know that our higher education institutions are the economic engine of our state. And that includes our technical colleges. We had a combined hearing between higher ed and education finance to make sure we are looking at how we can bring in CTE courses and kind of really invest in our junior and senior years in high school, so that they can get certified in different areas by the time they leave high school. So I know Edina is doing an incredible job around programming right now. They did a public-private partnership and started it all on their own, but we're trying to put some more money into making sure districts have that ability to do that organic organizing with their businesses around them to see what those pathways need to be. Because at the state, we can't just go, hey, everybody should do welding, because not every community needs somebody that welds. So really looking in those CNA programs, the EMS programs, the computer programs, junior and senior, those pathways for kids, because a 4-year college isn't for everybody. And I am hopeful that we're finally realizing that, not putting as much pressure on our kids, because there's a lot of great job opportunities that don't necessarily entail a 4-year college. I was just down at the Dakota County Tech College, and one of the students said it best. He said, look, think about it. Who did we consider essential workers during the pandemic? Those were a lot of folks that worked technical jobs, trucking, getting food on our tables, folks that were in our healthcare system, taking care of folks when they needed to be isolated. So really looking at all those different aspects for students to be able to be successful after they leave our secondary institutions. More connections with our tribal colleges and workforce development. Housing, we did an enormous amount of investment in both in homeless youth, in stabilizing housing and first-time home buyers, but mostly around affordable housing and workforce housing. That is key to being able to get folks into jobs. And it's also key into getting students to have success in school, because if they don't know where they're going to sleep that night, it's really hard to concentrate. But the affordable housing, besides the different pathways to home that we did in the tax bill, we put together a 0.25 cent sales tax that is going to go directly to affordable housing. This is probably one of the biggest investments we'll ever make in making sure we can build that market. And what I'm excited, and I was also sad to hear that our Commissioner Chris Latondras is leaving, but he is going to head up as the executive director of Beacon Interfaith Outreach, and to help all the other nonprofits and for-profits kind of look at, okay, now we have this money. How do we coordinate? How do we use it the most efficient way we can? Looking in human services kind of dovetails into everything we were talking about healthcare, but mostly investing in our nursing homes, making sure that they have the staff there to take care of us. We have woefully forgotten our young children under 5 in the childcare industry, and then our seniors that are in the nursing homes and the healthcare industry. We don't invest on them as much as we should, and we're trying to change that. Also, raising wages for our healthcare professionals, and also more money into combating that opioid epidemic. And before I forget, all these kind of dovetail into education. So we are providing Narcan. We put money into the education finance budget to have Narcan in all of our high schools, actually all of our schools, just in case for our kiddos. We also, Senator Swedzinski and Representative Feist carried a bill that the American Jewish women have been pushing for a long time, and the students have gotten behind it and really brought it across the finish line, and that is to have menstrual products in all our schools as well. So that was part of that same funding stream. You have the jobs one and labor. I'm just kind of lump that all together. We did a ton of investment into first-time business owners, small businesses, improving childcare access, increasing capital for folks that are trying to start small businesses, because when the interest rate goes up like that, capital tightens up, and then folks have a really hard time getting the investments that they need for their businesses. Job training, BIPOC businesses. Just there was a plethora of one-time money that was spent in those bills to help kind of start up small businesses and businesses across the state. And let's see here. Sorry. Our judiciary system, I'll do judiciary and then public safety. Kind of our judiciary system, we had been way behind on paying our public defenders and civil legal services. And this is for folks that can't afford lawyers, and also for the folks that are working in those systems. Our public defenders had not gotten a pay increase that was substantial, or even catching up to inflation for decades. We put money into our judges, into our civil legal services, folks that the lawyers that work there, protections for private for student information. There's just a lot in there with the judicial system. Basically, the goal was making it a more equitable system for all as well. Workforce safety, that was with the Earned Sick and Safe Leave. I'm trying to get down to public safety so I could talk about it for this at the same time. We did the legacy bill, public safety, gun violence prevention. We passed the red flag law and expanded background checks. We added more support for law enforcement and victims of crime. There is money in law enforcement for training and retention in the public safety bill. There was also $300 million that was in the tax bill that will go out to cities kind of along the same framework as local government aid does. We also did a lot of violence prevention, intervention, and rehabilitation. As you've seen in the news too, there's still some infrastructure issues that we need to do in our prison systems as well. What folks sometimes don't realize, in Minnesota, we're about the 49th in incarceration. So we have a lot of diversion programs and a lot of probationary programs. But when you go to jail, you spend about 2/3 of your time behind bars and 1/3 on probation. And about 85% of our folks that are in our prison system right now will be returning to society. And we want to make sure that they're successful, so we don't have the recidivism and have that revolving door. So there's a lot of investments we make there. And then tax cuts. And then I'll go into education or transportation and then education, then we're done. Oh, we have veterans too. Tax cuts, we invested in a lot of programs so that we're cutting child poverty by a third by expanding the working family credit. We expanded local government aid and county program aid so that our cities are on equal footing to take care of their infrastructure, like flushing toilets and driving on roads. We reduced the cost for homeowners and renters by looking at property tax cuts and renters credit. Now, at the city level is really who sets all the property taxes because they're the ones that figure out their levies. But at the state level, we can exclude the value of a property on the front end, which hadn't been rebased since like 2013. So we did that. And then we could provide relief on the back end with the property tax refund. And we beefed up the senior deferral program as well. And people have questions about that. I can really get into the weeds, but I'm not going to do that right now. We're just trying to make it a little bit cheaper for folks to stay in their homes and help the communities meet their needs. There was a lot of other things in the tax bill. I was very proud of my expanding the historic tax credit to help rehab old buildings. Transportation, we leveraged federal infrastructure money to make sure that we're using it efficiently. And we provided money for transit projects and things looking around climate change, improving our driver vehicle access system. And then also in the tax bill was a 0.75% Metro-wide sales tax for transit, which is going to be really helpful in building out that arterial lines. People think it's just buses. It has to be multimodal buses, arterial lines, light rail transit. And it has to be a system that's strong and dependable so people then take it. Otherwise, they stay in their cars. And that is really leading to climate change. We also, for veterans, we did a ton with veterans for increasing veteran services, money to the VA, money to veterans homelessness. And then, of course, where my heart is and where I spent 70 hours a week on during session was education finance. We all know that public education is supposed to be the great equalizer. It hasn't always been. And we see that with our opportunity gap. And that was one of our goals in education finance, was to look at that opportunity gap, invest in our kids, and making sure that they could all be successful and meeting all their needs. Like I can't say enough, and Lieutenant Governor Flanagan says it the best, is that kids don't come in pieces. When they walk in that school door, you can't look at them and say, get to work without thinking, oh, wait a minute, you look like you're really hungry. I haven't watched the show, but I heard about it and I keep using it because it's a wonderful, it's the best analogy I can think of. There's this show called Severance. I think it's on Netflix. And it's about when adults go to work, they get in this elevator at work and it wipes their memory of home so they can just get to work and get things done. And then it does the reverse when they go home, they forget about work. And I was like, oh my God, that sounds like a really funny comedy. And they're like, no, it's a utopian, dystopian horror story because adults don't work that way, right? We all know we bring everything with us when we go to work and we bring work when we come home. But for decades, we've expected our kids to function that way in schools. We expect them to walk in the door, just get down and do the reading, writing, arithmetic. And we don't care if you're hungry. We don't care if you don't know where you're staying that night. If you have a toothache, if you just are having a bad day. And it reminds me of when in early childhood and family education classes that I took that saved my children from me, the teacher would always do this little exercise where she'd have a bottle of seltzer water, and she'd talk about how sometimes our kids can explode, but it's not just one thing, it's things that have piled up, and we have to kind of pull ourselves out and look at what's happening and saying, instead of going, what's wrong with you today, it's what happened to you today. And she would take a seltzer tablet and she'd put it in and say, they didn't get what the cereal they wanted for breakfast. They didn't get to wear their favorite shirt. They couldn't tie their shoes that morning. And every one of those was a seltzer tablet that went in. And by the time they get to school, everything just blew up. All that comes in our doors, and we have to figure out how to educate those kids. We don't have a choice. That's our duty. It's a constitutional duty to educate, have public education. So we have underinvested for 20 years. I started on the Hopkins LAC back in 2003, and we were talking about all these same issues that I got lucky enough to help be a part of fixing. Top of the mind is universal meals. Also, our education formula, which is super complicated, but we do something really important here in Minnesota. About 85% of our school's budget comes directly from the state. We relieved more of the property. In some states, it's like half and half property taxes, half from the state. We really took a lot of that off the property tax rolls, except for excess levies and operating levies districts can do. So we have a formula that has mostly on the general formula, but then there's like 14 different little categoricals that really deeply dive into what kids need between special education, English language learners, compensatory aid, which helps focus on kids that are behind, extended time revenue, which is for kids after school, districts transportation sparsity if they're driving their kids a long way and need some help. But we looked at that formula and we made sure that we indexed it to inflation. And we had been talking about that for 20 years because some years, there were 2 years where they got 0 and 0 increase, and we really haven't dug out of that hole. So now it's indexed to inflation. So every district, and we did it fiscally responsibly too, though. We put a cap on it. So there's a cap at 3%. So if inflation's above 3%, they'll still only get 3%. But if inflation is 3.5%, they'll get 3. But if it's like 2.5, they can still go up to 3. So it hovers in there. But we put a floor in. We put a floor in at 2%. So even if inflation's 0.5%, districts will still get 2% every year. And we do that in a 2-year budget cycle. So it's 2% the first year, rolls into the base the next year, and then there's 2% on top of that. So that is hopefully going to stabilize our schools. Now, remember what I said, though, we had 20 years of underfunding. So we could not turn that all around in one session. Our districts are still struggling and trying to make ends meet. So if your district's going out for a levy or referendum, please think about voting yes, because they're still trying to dig out from some of those holes. We also did something with, and I'm going to finish up here, the special education cross subsidy. Back in the 70s, the federal government put together the IDEA Act that said rightfully so, our kiddos with special needs should be in the least restrictive environment when they're learning. You can't just put them out in a room and have them not interact with everybody. They knew that was going to cost more money. And so they said, hey, we'll pay up to 40% of that. They never have. They've never paid more than 17. So districts have been pulling out of their general fund to make up that difference. And that's become that cross subsidy. When I started doing advocacy work 20 years ago, the cross subsidy was about 2% of a district's budget. It's now over 10% of most districts. So we cut that in half. We cut this cross subsidy by 50%. We tripled our EL per pupil formula. We invested in student support staff. So school counselors, which were one of the worst ratios in the country. We invested in school counselors, school social workers, school psychologists. We invested in mental health supports, full service community schools, where we pay for a coordinator to go into a district and work and figure out public-private partnerships about what that school needs, whether it is a dentist coming in once a month, or a food shelf there, or a health clinic, or what they need to make sure their whole community is healthy. We also put money into career pathways in college and technical education, building out our workforce to get more teachers of color. I could go on and on as I have, but I also want to make sure that we spend some time answering questions. And I'm sorry I talk so fast, but I hope you found that interesting. And you can always reach me on my legislative email if you have specific questions, and I'll drop it in the chat so you guys have it. But no, I want to make sure we have time for Sam to talk, but I'm open for questions. And now that I talk so fast, you probably have some. I'm also going to throw my cell phone in if anybody needs it.
I also want to mention that I did drop links to 2 documents that are a review of some of the laws that went into effect in July and in August.
So Ellen has a question.
Yeah, I was wondering, you guys were incredibly productive, and I just want to first say thank you for all your good work. I can see, we can barely talk about all the things that went on. So I want to just say thank you again for that. Must have been a lot of work. And I'm just wondering, what are the biggest priorities for you next year? What didn't get done that I'm hoping that you have the energy to have another really impactful year. And I'm just wondering what you see those priorities to be.
That's a really good question. I have a few that I'm working on. Actually, just visited with a local childcare center on the books right now. If you're a nonprofit childcare center that owns your own building, you can get a tax break on your property taxes, but not if you're renting a space. So personally, I'm looking at that one that's not out of in the education realm. Also making sure our Hometown Heroes Act that we put in place to help firefighters access money for PTSD, cardiac care, and cancer treatments is still in place. There's a few little things in taxes I think I'll be looking at as well, but mostly in education, what we're still looking at is, well, this falls into taxes. You know, I talked to you about levies that districts can do that go out to the voters, like the bond, technology, and operating. Currently, what we call equalize that for property poor districts. So Edina and Hopkins in Prairie, we don't have equalization because we're able to build that capacity. When Edina goes out for a levy, or Hopkins does, they can go out for, let's say they need $1. Their property tax owners will only pay 50 cents for that $1, but you get up in Lino Lakes and they have to pay $1.50 to get that $1. So equalization kind of brings that $1.50 down. So property poor districts can actually have that value in those bonds that they're asking for folks. Local government aid and county program aid does that too at the city level, but we haven't rebased that and fixed that for a long time. And we have to do that, but that I'm trying to get into the tax bill because it really is a property tax credit. It's not going directly into our, you know, it is getting into our schools, but it's more to alleviate the taxing burden on the local units. So the tax chair and I are arm wrestling over that. One thing that education is going to kind of face next year is that we had a really good ongoing budget target. That's what we call the tails. So while we set a state budget for 2 years, we also look out to the next 2 years, and programs that we put in place that continually need funding would have to have that target in that ongoing funding in those out 2 years. Otherwise, there's things that we did a lot with money for one-time funding. Best example would be in the READ Act. We had $35 million in for one-time funding for curriculum for districts to switch over their curriculum. The rest of the money was going into ongoing costs on training teachers as they go along, right? So education, we got the best ongoing target. I'm not sure how much of a supplemental budget we have, but I'm pretty sure I know I'm not going to get any ongoing money because we got a lot of it last year. So we're looking at ways that we can do things with one-time money in education next year. If we do get ongoing money, we did not really fix, or we didn't really address the teacher pension issue, which is part of retention. And we'd want to make sure we had ongoing money for whatever that fix was, so that we always usually pick up the employer portion for the district. But there's a lot of one-time money that we can spend in education around more grants, filling up that curriculum grant, I want to do some more stuff around computer science and coding. There's a lot of other areas that we can help with pipeline programs, why we put money into wanting to have more school counselors, school nurses, and school psychologists in our classrooms. We did put a one-time pipeline program in there that's going to need more money to get people to go into those fields. So we're looking at a lot of that, and a lot of working really closely with the Education Policy Chair, Chair Larry Pryor, who's right over the border in Minnetonka. We did a lot of stabilizing of districts' funding this year, and we really want to make sure now that they are doing what we asked them to do with that funding, because they've just been trying to barely keep afloat, and tackling that opportunity gap has not always been the forefront. And now we're going to be looking at how do we attach that. Districts and I, they kind of like, they call it a mandate, I call it accountability. So we're having those discussions. That was a really long answer. I'm sorry.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I am going to have us shift now so that we can cover the election laws. So if people have other questions about the material that Representative Youakim has covered, please hold them. We'll get back to questions. Now we're going to shift to Sam Streukens from the State League of Women Voters to cover election law, but also to tell us how leaguers were involved throughout the state in the work that was done at the legislature this year and how they can be involved in the next session as well. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Representative Youakim, and also for League of Women Voters of Edina for having me here to talk to you all about the work that we were involved in at the Capitol in 2023 and what sorts of things that we passed, but also opportunities to get more involved in the future. I know that you all are very active already with the voter services work, so this presentation will be particularly interesting to you. And also, I've seen many of you at the Capitol as well, so it would be, this might not be new to you. So I'm going to cover most of the changes that happened to election policy this year. House File 3 strengthens the freedom to vote, protects Minnesota voters, protects our democratic institutions, and empowers Minnesota voters. And I'm going to go into who, what, and how does that. So who can vote? As this was a separate bill that passed earlier in session, but the restoration of voting rights for those who have left prison behind now is law. So this is a really important change that we had been working for over 20 years, and now we have the important work to do to register voters and get them to vote in our communities. Next, automatic voter registration. This is a huge one. This could affect, 500,000 Minnesotans, I believe, and will take effect in 2024. Once the Secretary of State's office has worked out all the logistics with the other state agencies. But essentially, now when you go to fill out your form to get your driver's license or renew your health insurance through the state, anything that in interaction with the state will, if you meet the requirements to be registered to vote, you will be added to the voter rolls. So this important distinction there is if you are not a citizen and can't prove that, you will not be registered to vote as well. So this is a really secure process and will reduce the work of election administrators and also all of you to register people to vote, but we'll still need to make sure that all these new folks vote. So we have a lot of work to do. And a really important celebratory change is the pre-registration of 16 and 17-year-olds. As many of you know, we talked about earlier on this call that you can go to high schools now where and reach out to students to let them know that they can sign a form that will register them to vote upon their 18th birthday. This is the same form as the normal registration, but you instead check a box, that you are at least 16 years old, and many of you have seen this, and then you will be sent a card on your 18th birthday confirming that you still live where you do, and this will allow people to, especially those who might, not be aware of the right to vote or some of the intricacies, we can get them into the system ready to go, and it's very helpful in getting youth empowered. So here are some of the dates. Pre-registration and voting rights for those who have left prison behind is already in effect, and around January, automatic voter registration will take place. So how we vote, and now a permanent absentee voter list beginning June 1st, 2024 will take effect, so that if you are someone who likes to vote from home, you will automatically get an absentee ballot each year following 2024 and when you apply for that. And also now, instead of just 7 days before, you can directly put your ballot into the reader 18 days before election day at your local county office. So now, also you can assist more than 3 voters. There's no requirement when you go to the polling place, and you can return your absentee ballot until 8 p.m. on the day of the election. That changed from 3 p.m. And that would be, again, to your county election office. And same, there's going to be more support for assisted living facilities and battered women's shelters that are available to healthcare facilities for our absentee ballot delivery. Another important change is that many folks who might not vote because they don't have the information in the language that they are most comfortable with. So now, if certain requirements are met, so if more than 20% of an area speaks English less than very well, they will election officials will be required to have an interpreter available for that population. And same, if 10 or more voters request it, there would also be an interpreter available, and there will be translated voting instructions and sample ballots in more languages than English in polling places. So this is some more technical changes here. Electronic signature on election day can be done electronically or on a paper as it's previously been done. And same, once a county, which most I believe have an electronic voting system in place, they cannot return to mechanically or hand counting the tallying of ballots. So again, all of these changes are taking effect except for the permanent absentee voter list, which will be next year. So voting hours, when we vote, this is a change that will allow election offices to be open more before the election. This includes the Sunday before the election and the 2 Saturdays before the Tuesday election in November. So this will put some, allow for more opportunity to vote, but also more hours for election officials. So we'll have to give them our extra support. Early voting, process of casting a ballot, just changes the name from absentee to early direct voting, meaning you don't have to fill out the form saying that you're an absentee voter. This is, again, I believe the 18 days or before, not 100% sure on that. I need to double check. Time off from work to vote. If you go to vote in the 46 days before the election, you can also get that time off from your employer rather than just on election day when voting in person is allowed. So that's an important change for us to make our communities aware of. So these are all in effect, except for early voting taking place January 1st. Temporarily polling places. This is an important change for Indian reservations. So if there is if they request one, the county auditor must have an additional polling place on that location. I think that's for just one day, but would make it more accessible to some places that it might be hard to get to the county election office, and so that will instead come to them. And the county auditor may also establish additional polling places with the hours attached. And that is starting effect now. Protecting the vote. So we're kind of getting ahead of the curve here in Minnesota with voter intimidation, harassment. We want to make sure that we allow everyone to be able to vote. And so if someone tries to intimidate voters in the 60 days before an election, well, that's a different thing. Sorry. So also protecting election officials. This now it will be a misdemeanor to intimidate and harass election officials, including tampering with electronic equipment, and also allowing and sharing personal information of election officials to the public, including like someone's address or whatever, just by knowingly doing that. So soliciting near polling places, this, is something we've seen before. You are not supposed to stand a certain distance from the polling place, but also this prohibits wearing, exhibiting any item that displays reference to a candidate, ballot question, or political party when you're at the polling place. Protects also, state canvassing board certifies the vote totals every year. And this is just requiring that, making it, clear in statute that whoever receives the highest number of votes for federal and state wins the election. So some additional changes, the National Popular Vote Compact we advocated for here in Minnesota. Now we've added our state's electors to make that we are 205 out of the 270 needed nationally in order for the president to be elected by direct popular vote. So again, that's not going to happen because Minnesota passed it, but Minnesota now has agreed to the compact, adding to the total of the electoral college votes. So we are 205 now out of 270 before that happens. So that is a LWV US position. So they are working with other local and state leagues to get that total up to 270. In Minnesota, there was a block on the funding that came from the Help America Vote Act. And now the Secretary of State will be allowed to use money to make upgrades to election security, and also nearly $500,000 of the money from the Help America Vote Act was made available to election administrators across the state to improve and upgrade their voting equipment. And I heard that you all have a program on the ranked choice voting topic coming up in the fall, but just to briefly mention that the Office of the Secretary of State is going to include whether or not Minnesota might use ranked choice voting at the statewide level in their study. And the interim report is due out in February. The final report is probably the end of next year. So I'm going to look at the time here. This is a 2-minute video. It's on our webpage. I can also post in the chat. But Representative went over most of the changes that happened this year, and a lot of them included the climate and environment. So I'm not going to play this video, but I will share it. It's really good, and just recommend it for some of those other changes. Let's see here. All right, so I'm gonna go to the next slide. So as you can see, we did more than just advocate on election policy. we were at the Capitol a lot at the end of the session, rallying for the ERA and making sure that we received support from our legislators, knowing that this is an issue the league has championed for a very long time, and we received bipartisan support for an inclusive inclusive language to include women, religion, disability, and more in an equal rights amendment underneath the law. So we'll see how, and that needs to be approved by the House in 2024 and then eventually placed on the ballot to go to Minnesota voters. The firearms we mentioned, and civics education. We went through Representative Youakim's committee on the bill that will require there to be a civics course in 11th or 12th grade that is, taking effect now. So anything that we can do to, work with our high schools across the state to support this effort. This is going to be really important for young people to understand how government works and how they can get involved. So briefly, I'm going to just mention some things here. So we advocated at the Capitol with league members, but also with partners across the state in our various issue areas. So with the Restore the Vote bill, we worked together with a coalition of, it was like 100 organizations who were concerned about re-enfranchising Minnesotans to be able to vote as it impacts individuals, communities, and it was, a human rights issue. So the other voting coalition we worked with was We Choose Us. They are a coalition of 30 plus and growing organizations concerned about democracy. They're advocating for democracy and pro-voter policies in the state. And we continue to work with them to implement the changes that we see through high schools, through the Restore the Vote coalition, and more. So Clean Elections Minnesota, great partner as well. And our priority for 2024, I'll mention, is redistricting. So the Minnesota Census and Democracy Partnership and Common Cause Minnesota are both groups that are working to mobilize Minnesotans of all backgrounds to make their voice heard in the democratic process and to allow, and the league is very interested in, the fair maps process and making sure that everyone is included in our democracy. So we're working with them. Minnesota Environmental Partnership, they're the ones who created that video and are a group of organizations dedicated to our environment and climate change. So we are welcome, or in good hands, working with all these partners and coalitions to achieve our policy priorities and the advocacy positions that the league believes and works for. I feel like I should stop my presentation now, but I will welcome you all to reach out to me about some of the opportunities for learning more about the legislative process and getting to know all the great organizations that we work with, local league leaders across the state. We do weekly Zoom meetings when the legislative session starts on February 12th, and just talk about the legislation for that week and follow it through, follow all the bills that passed through this last year through committees, and making sure that we're able to testify if needed and just sort of observe what's happening and be a trusted source of information. So I'll stop my presentation.
Sam, I have a question for you. This is Colleen Feige. The partnerships that you've established, does that mean that the local leagues can also partner with those groups? Sort of like the question of, when you have a position, if the state has a position, we can use that to advocate as well. Can we partner with those groups that are on that list?
Yeah, great question, Colleen. Thanks. And I've heard that from other local leagues as well. You should definitely partner with our existing partners at the state level. But more than that, I think there are groups within your community that aren't state level partners who share our same issues and values. So when that happens, we welcome you to connect with them, and they can get connected with some of our other coalitions. So if they're interested in climate and environment or democracy, we can work with them to get added to the MEP group or to the We Choose Us calls. So that kind of grows our coalition across Minnesota. And yeah, I mean, many of you are involved in other organizations, maybe than the league. So I guess that means that you might already be members of like a group that we're a partner with, perhaps. And I definitely, would hope that you feel like you can work with them as well. And if it's a league position that shares something, that they're advocating for, then we can kind of add the league's voice behind it. So send out an action alert to our league members if it's something that we support as well. So that way we can kind of work together when we're at the Capitol, and then also around community engagement. We are not working in silos, but together we're at the high school, right? Like, we don't want someone to be tabling next to you, but tabling together. So I hope that answers your question. I think that's a ongoing thing that if there's specific questions, I would love to meet with them and meet with you to talk about what work we're already doing with that organization.
Thanks, Sam.
Thank you both for the great presentations. I think we can open it now for questions on any of the topics, any of the legislation that's been addressed so far today, and as well as questions about next year. And you can put a question in chat if you'd like, or just raise a hand and we'll call on you.
And Sam just put his email address in chat. Thank you, Sam.
Yeah, I think we have more information in the chat than perhaps in any other meeting. Lots of links to legislation, information about this year's legislation. Representative Youakim has put her telephone number in the chat, so please check that out if you haven't already.
Hats off to both of the presenters. Very thorough and complete. I really appreciated the update.
I agree. It was very, very thorough, for sure. And it certainly gives us as the league lots of work to do in many, many ways. But that's what we're here for.
So Representative Youakim, what was the most gratifying of the things that you were able to work on this year, able to get accomplished?
Man, that's a tough one. There's two that tie, that I'd have to say tie for me, is that indexing the formula to inflation. Kind of had to fight the Senate for that a little bit, but governor's staff was, Commissioner Willie Jett was a great partner in that debate to help get that done too. But universal meals, I think, probably is really the highlight. It was a tough slog. I think we did not get very many. I know this is nonpartisan, but I think we only got 2 votes across the aisle in the whole legislature, and that was sad. But feeding kids just makes so much sense. We require them by law to be in our schools. we require them by law to be in our schools, and they can't really it just relieves such a burden and one less thing they have to think about when they're trying to develop their growing brains. And so, yeah, I'd have to say universal meals.
That one's had some great press nationwide as well. And I think has also been held up as an example.
Yeah, there's 6 of us in the state, 6 states in the country.
And where were we? We're the 6th of the 6, or were there other
I
legislature?
believe so. And I think there's 2 working on it right now, or have some type of form of it that's beyond what we did with the free and reduced lunch originally. So yeah, the key is to make sure. So part of the reason why it works so well for us is that community eligibility program that the federal government did. They switched that to direct certification over COVID. So it showed us how it could get done instead of having to have the forms there's other ways they're certifying folks. And our past law, any district that had more than 60% of their population that qualified for free and reduced lunch would get lunch and breakfast for their kids. And then there was a sliding fee scale between 40% and 60%. So what we did by maximizing the community eligibility program and the federal dollars, that took care of about 83% of those kids that could qualify. The rest, that's where we're really struggling to get forms and everything. And it was just a lot of time out of the district's day. And then we're making out the difference at the state level. And like I said, that's about $250 a kid for the whole entire year.
There was an editorial, I think, in the Star Tribune this week, reminding people that it's still important for them to put in the eligibility forms. Would you like to talk about
that is important too, because there's still, when I told you about those different weird categoricals that we have. So you might have heard compensatory aid a lot mentioned with universal meals, and that is a formula that we use to figure out, to give more money to schools where kids are struggling to do intervention for reading or math. And when you do a formula and trying to figure out, instead of kind of like the census, instead of sometimes counting every person, you kind of extrapolate or use a formula to do it. One of the indicators that we used there was those free and reduced lunch forms. So now we're kind of switching that over. We held it stable for a few years. We're looking at language to switch that over to either census tract data or just another indicator to say, we were saying, okay, if you qualify for free and reduced lunch, chances are you're struggling in school. So that's how we were using it, but we are looking at a different indicator. But that's still important for districts to do it, because we can see those 83% that have the direct certification, but we have to kind of muddle and find those other 17%. So yeah, it's still important to turn them in for now, but we're still working on that.
I'd like to ask Sam the same question. What were you most proud of that you lobbied on regarding the voting changes that I think, was this your first year in that position? I thought so. So from a novice to this, let's hear what you were most proud of, Sam.
Yeah, thanks, Colleen. I was an intern for the session before this, focused on climate policy, but now was my first on the democracy space, which is what the league does. So I was, brought up to speed by all of the lobbyists that I work with in the Lobbying Observer Corps, or former lobbyists, that are current league members, telling me what we should be doing. But yeah, definitely restored the vote, because it was just so joyful. Everybody, we got a lot of we got a lot of Republican support even for that too. So it was just really fun to hear the stories of those impacted by, not in their belief that, voting is going to, better serve the community, and just in the way that we interacted with that as the league, to encourage, voting, and just to believe that everyone should be valued. And just, I was just really cool to be at the Capitol late at night. Just, that was the only one where I felt, oh, I really want to be here at 11 p.m. But I know, I'm sure all of them were good, but that one was especially very camaraderie focused. Like,
I forgot to mention that one. I mean, I literally, when I took that vote, I cried. It's just because it's another one that we'd been working on for a long time. I was a Senate staffer for Judiciary, and we were working on that 10, 12 years ago. And it really makes a huge difference in people's lives and helps with that recidivism. But you guys all know that. You've seen all the data.
And I several years ago, Susan Clark and I attended something at the state capitol with Steve Simon, and there was a youngish woman in her 30s. She had served her prison term for a felony, and she would not be able to vote until she was 71. And I will never forget that. That was such an impact. She was just stating the fact. And I thought that was really significant in my mind. So congratulations, Cheryl, for voting and shedding a tear for all the hard work, and Sam for you pushing that and being there at 11 at night.
that might have been an exaggeration, but
Well, no, that probably wasn't. If you were in the working in the Congress of the United States, you would be there until at least 11 at night on the September 30th. They do it every year, or almost every year.
Yeah, I think our Speaker Hortman really cares a lot about people's safety. So and health, and we've done this year we only had a few times where we spent past midnight, but we went up to midnight a lot. But the past midnight was when we looked at LGBTQ rights and banning conversion therapy. So that was the one time we spent overnight this year, which was worth it.
Well, thank you for your service in doing all of that. You and all of your colleagues, whether they are pro or con to the event, they're there to serve.
Exactly. And I'm so glad that you guys emphasize that, because it's really important. I've spent 4 years of my 9 years in the minority and 5 years in the majority. And it is so important to build those relationships and get things done together. And that's what makes democracy work. So thank you for highlighting that and focusing on that.
Yeah. Great.
We have time for a couple more questions. Does anybody else have a question or a comment?
I would have a brief comment, and this is like a regeneration of things. I think a lot of us waited years for this kind of an experience to happen in our legislature, and it's easy to get complacent. Things may not continue this way. I think we have to continue to be vigilant. And Cheryl, you've worked really hard, and Sam too, to have all these things happen. And we can't relax. We still have to show up. When there are hearings, when there are other things going on, we still have to show up. And that's, the older I get, the tougher that is. But it's really important. And sometimes the meetings get long and they get late, but that's, I think those of you people on this meeting now, you've been there, done that, and you know how important it is. So just stating the obvious.
And thank you. Thank you for also focusing on our local elections. School districts and school and city councils really shape our community more than anybody sometimes understands. And every time I hear somebody say it's an off year, we don't have an election, it's like, no, it might be an odd year, you still have an election. So thank you for hosting all the forums, especially for our local officials. It's sometimes the one way they can get their voices heard and say what they stand for. So I hate to be effusive about it, but having started on a city council, it really does make a huge difference.
And the one thing we will, the league will be at Malibu this year. That's the event for the trick-or-treaters that come in. And given that this is a school board election, I understand it's a little bit of an unusual one, 3 candidates for 3 positions, but we get a lot of young families there. They're little kids that are trick-or-treating and adults that are with them. And oftentimes we will kind of we often will encourage people to vote in the school board election, which is November 7th this year. But it's a great way to kind of build the enthusiasm around that. So, and it is important. And we also have the referendum around the local sales tax, which we'll cover in our meeting on October. I'm not sure the date right off the top of my head, but in October, the morning meeting to talk about that.
It's the 12th.
Thank you.
Thursday, the 12th.
Great. So any other questions or just thanks to the presenters and to all of you who attended? Hope you found it useful. And Cheryl, I may ask you to, I was supposed to take notes for the newsletter. I have 6 pages of notes. So I might ask you for a little help with some of yours. And I think I've got most of yours, Sam, but I may contact you as well.
No problem. You got my cell phone, so always feel free.
Thank you. Okay, everyone, have a good rest of your day. I hear it's maybe going to be 80 today. So back to summer. And we've got some thanks heading in the chat. So hitting the chat. Thank you from all of us. I think that's a great way to say it. And we'll look to you again, I'm sure.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.